Most histories of the Second World War measure survival in divisions, tonnage, and industrial output. They chart tank production curves and shipping losses. But for millions of peasants across Europe and Asia, the war was not measured in armored advances. It was measured in calories. It was measured in whether there would be bread in February, seed in April, and enough left after requisitions to keep children alive until harvest. Before we go further, if you value serious, in-depth historical analysis that looks past the battlefield and into the lived mechanics of survival, subscribe to the Survival Record and share this video with others who appreciate the deeper layers of history. The lesser-known reality is this. In vast rural regions under occupation or bombardment, peasants survived not because supply chains held, but because they quietly adapted centuries-old subsistence knowledge to modern total war. They improvised systems that worked beneath the radar of armies and governments. These were not heroic charges. They were practical decisions made under constraint, and in many cases, they kept entire communities alive year-round. Let's examine 7 of those genius wartime adaptations. When entire villages replanned their agriculture around occupation quotas, under German occupation, especially in places like rural Poland and parts of Ukraine, official grain quotas were brutally enforced. The occupying authorities requisitioned wheat and rye to feed the Wehrmacht and cities in the Reich. On paper, yields were calculated to the kilogram. In practice, peasants quickly realized that growing visible, easily counted staple grains made them vulnerable. So they shifted. Instead of maximizing wheat acreage, many farmers expanded cultivation of root vegetables. Potatoes, beets, turnips, crops harder to count precisely and easier to conceal. Potatoes in particular became strategic. Buried underground and stored in cellars, they were less visible to requisition patrols than stacked grain sacks. A field of wheat announces its yield months before harvest. A potato field does not. In occupied France and the Low Countries, similar adjustments occurred. Livestock numbers were reported and inspected, so peasants reduced visible herd sizes while increasing small-scale poultry and rabbit breeding. These animals required less feed, reproduced quickly, and could be hidden or slaughtered discreetly. The lesson was simple but profound. Resilience comes from diversification and opacity. When centralized authority extracts predictable output, survival depends on reducing predictability. Seed saving became an act of quiet resistance. In both Eastern Europe and China during the war against Japan, seed grain was a matter of life and death. Occupying forces often seized stored grain, leaving peasants with barely enough for consumption, let alone planting. In response, rural communities developed layered seed hiding strategies. In parts of the Soviet Union after the German invasion in 1941, families stored small quantities of seed in multiple hidden locations, beneath floorboards, sealed inside clay vessels, buried in fields, or entrusted to extended kin in neighboring villages. The goal was redundancy. If one cache was discovered, another might survive. In China's countryside during the Second Sino-Japanese War, which later merged into the global conflict, similar strategies appeared. Peasants stored seed in sealed bamboo tubes or waterproof containers sunk in irrigation canals. Seed preservation was treated not as surplus management but as strategic planning. This practice influenced post-war agricultural doctrine in several regions. The experience of near-total confiscation reinforced the importance of decentralized storage. Later, Cold War civil defense planning in Eastern Europe retained elements of this thinking. Food security depended on distributed reserves, not single depots. The survivalist lesson is clear. Redundancy is not waste, it is insurance against systemic shock. Small livestock quietly replaced large animals as the backbone of protein. Large livestock, cows, horses, draft animals, were requisitioned by occupying armies across Europe and Asia. Horses pulled artillery, cattle fed troops. For peasants, losing a cow meant losing milk, manure, and traction. Communities adapted by turning to animals that required minimal space and could be concealed. Rabbits became central to protein supply in France and Belgium. They bred quickly, consumed kitchen scraps, and could be raised indoors. Chickens, too, were kept in hidden coops or even inside dwellings during harsh winters. In the Soviet Union, after catastrophic losses in 1941 and 1942, backyard poultry and goat keeping expanded dramatically in non-occupied zones. Goats required less pasture than cattle and were harder for authorities to track systematically. These shifts were not ideal. They reflected scarcity, but they maintained a baseline protein supply that prevented total nutritional collapse. Modern military survival manuals still emphasize small, fast-reproducing livestock in prolonged disruption scenarios. The wartime peasant did not consult doctrine, he wrote it through necessity. Forest knowledge became a parallel food system. In regions like Belarus, the Balkans, and parts of Scandinavia, forests were not wilderness, they were larders. Partisan warfare in Eastern Europe pushed many civilians into wooded areas. There, survival depended on knowledge often dismissed in peacetime as folklore, edible mushrooms, wild berries, tree sap, and small game trapping. In Yugoslavia, rural families who supported partisan fighters relied heavily on foraged foods to avoid drawing attention through visible farming activity. In Finland during the Continuation War, civilian rationing was severe. Foraging for cloudberries, lingonberries, and wild greens supplemented official allocations. The state even encouraged berry-picking campaigns to stabilize vitamin intake. What distinguished successful communities was not merely access to forests, but generational knowledge. Knowing which mushroom would sustain you and which would poison you was not theoretical. In modern resilience planning, wild food foraging is often treated as supplemental. In wartime Europe, it was structural. It absorbed the shock when formal systems failed. Cellars and earth storage turned temperature into an ally. Refrigeration was, well, pretty rare in rural areas during the 1940s. Preservation depended on physical principles understood long before electricity. Across Eastern Europe, underground root cellars, often dug into hillsides or beneath barns, became lifelines. Potatoes, carrots, cabbage, and beets could be stored for months in cool, stable conditions. Sauerkraut and other fermented vegetables provided vitamins through winter. In the Netherlands, during the hunger winter of 1944–45, urban residents suffered acutely because they lacked these rural storage systems. Peasants with functional cellars fared better, though requisitions still cut deeply. In parts of rural Japan, traditional earthen storehouses insulated rice and sweet potatoes against humidity and temperature swings during wartime shortages. These structures, built decades earlier, became critical assets. The insight here is not romantic. Infrastructure built in stable times determines survival in unstable ones. Earth is a thermal battery. Communities that invested in passive storage before crisis endured longer when industrial supply chains faltered. Informal barter networks replaced currency almost overnight. As inflation and rationing destabilized formal economies, peasants across occupied Europe shifted to barter. In Greece during the Axis occupation, currency collapsed into near worthlessness. Rural producers exchanged olive oil, grain, and vegetables directly for tools, cloth, or labor. In France, black markets thrived not merely as criminal enterprises, but as parallel distribution systems. Peasants transported goods at night to avoid checkpoints. Urban families traveled to the countryside carrying jewelry or heirlooms to trade for flour or eggs. These exchanges were risky. Penalties could be severe, but they redistributed calories more flexibly than rigid ration systems. Economists studying wartime Greece later noted how rapidly communities reverted to trust-based exchange. Social capital replaced monetary capital. Survival depended on relationships as much as yield. For modern preparedness thinking, this underscores a hard truth. In systemic breakdown, networks matter more than cash. Crop selection quietly shifted toward resilience over profit. Before the war, many European farmers were integrated into market systems that rewarded certain cash crops. Wartime disruption reversed those incentives. In parts of Italy and southern France, farmers reduced wine grape production and expanded cereals and legumes. Profit gave way to caloric density. Beans, lentils, and hardy grains offered reliable nutrition and improved soil fertility. In the Soviet rear areas, agronomists promoted fast-maturing crop varieties to compensate for labor shortages and truncated growing seasons caused by displacement. Women, elderly men, and children took over much agricultural labor after mass mobilization. Crops that required less mechanization and fewer draft animals were prioritized. These decisions were pragmatic. They reflected a reorientation from export value to subsistence security. Post-war agricultural reforms in several countries retained aspects of this thinking. Food self-sufficiency became a strategic priority during the early Cold War, influenced in part by memories of wartime hunger. Resilience, once learned under duress, reshaped policy. What unites these 7 adaptations is not ingenuity in isolation. It is the disciplined application of local knowledge under extreme pressure. Peasants did not have strategic briefings. They observed patterns, requisitions, target visibility. Armies seize large assets. Winter punishes the unprepared. Currency can fail. Seed once lost is difficult to recover, so they acted accordingly. World War II is often framed as an industrial war, won by factories and oil reserves. That is true at the macro level. But at the micro level, survival hinged on buried seed jars, hidden rabbit hutches and cellars dug decades before the first bomb fell. For those interested in preparedness today, these stories offer sober lessons. Diversify food sources, build redundancy, invest in passive infrastructure, preserve knowledge that does not depend on technology, cultivate networks of trust. History does not repeat mechanically, but human vulnerability to disruption remains constant. Remembering how ordinary rural families navigated total war broadens our understanding of resilience. It reminds us that survival is rarely dramatic, it is cumulative, it is methodical, and it often depends on decisions made long before crisis arrives. If you value this kind of careful, grounded historical exploration, subscribe to The Survival Record and share this video with others who want more than surface-level war narratives. The overlooked details are often the ones that endure.